Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Harvest Lectures. I'm really excited to have Anu with us tonight. Anu has been working with us, doing stuff with our kind of Sustained Church conference. It's been fantastic. She's got an amazing book out, Liberation for the Earth. So I definitely recommend you to go check that out. It's a fantastic book. So you can get that anywhere. So get that book. Also, she's just a wealth of information. Even before this Zoom call started, we were having such a good discussion. So it makes me so excited for this talk and to engage with that book as well. So I'm just going to hand it right over to Anu, and we're really excited to have you with us, Anu. So take it away.
Thanks, John. It's always great to be here at Hazelnut. I think that I have a real debt of gratitude to the Hazelnut community because when I was writing my book, I came and sort of trialed it a little bit at Hazelnut, which was kind of fantastic for me. And I was able to really talk through a lot of the different issues and workshop things a little bit. So I'm really always grateful to be here at Hazelnut with everyone, whether you're joining us today or whether you'll be joining us later on the YouTube channel and so on. So thank you very much again, and thank you for having me back. I'm going to talk a little bit today about building communities for eco-justice, and so this sort of extends a little bit of the work that I have been doing. With on environmental justice, and it's a little bit of, I'm also going to draw a little bit from a chapter that I've just finished writing for a book that's being edited by Victoria Tana and Benjamin Elders for Churches Together England, that's looking at concepts of mission and missiology and what it means to move without churches and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to see if my screen will do the thing where it goes into slideshow. I have one of the world's oldest laptops, so here we go. There we are. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. So my talk today is titled Building Communities for Eco-Justice. And if you've so a lot of the work that I do in environmental justice and eco-theology is about thinking through the connections between racial justice and environmental justice, and also trying to bring in some of those links on gender justice as well. The sort of summation being that we cannot work for environmental justice if we are not also moving towards work that is anti-racist, if we're not building a work that is questioning the death-creating structures of capital that continue to essentially plague and plunder the world in which we live in, and have been doing so historically for many, many years. And so in that sense, I want to talk a little bit today about this concept of what was called communities of resistance, which is a concept I take from I'm a Sri Lankan, and so I'm using the work of another British Sri Lankan cultural theorist and novelist, Ambala Sivanandan, who sadly passed into the land of the ancestors a few years ago. But he was very involved in the struggles, the anti-racist struggles in the United Kingdom in the 1970s and the 1980s. And he also came, and he lived in the north of Sri Lanka, so he came from a particular context of ethnic struggle into the UK, into that sort of febrile situation of the United Kingdom at the time. And so he was sort of trying to think through, what does it mean to create, or what does it mean to struggle, and what does it mean to build resistance? So he's trying to sort of understand the socio-political culture in which he, an immigrant to the United Kingdom, I myself am an immigrant to the United Kingdom, lived in, and how to kind of think through issues of power, racism, and the ways in which communities were denied agency when they were trying to find ways to organize. That might be something that maybe those of you who are involved in environmental justice efforts are also feeling right now. And importantly, some of the things that he was doing is he started to sort of document the self-activity and the mobilizing of immigrants against injustice and for dignity. And he begins to kind of document the political economy of racism, the ways in which generations of social workers and school teachers and university workers were being marginalized. And through a series of historical documentation, as well as his kind of like in-depth lived experience, he focuses his mobilizations on what he calls this idea of political blackness. So political blackness, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a radical consciousness emerging in the 60s and into the 70s in the United Kingdom as a reaction to the racism being experienced by Commonwealth communities. And when Sivanandan looks to understand and define this, he discusses Black power, which is envisioned as a political metaphor, which focuses on transforming the condition of powerlessness. And he links this to Black power movements in the UK and the US, and also to the various movements in the Third World that were around in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that were seeking to end white hegemony. So essentially, we can define this as a political identity that sort of begins that is defined and understood by Black communities, but then is also sort of taken forward by Asian and other activists, trying to transform what was a pejorative and disparaging term with a new meaning, and this new meaning is imbued with this idea of communities of resistance. In recent years, this understanding of political blackness has fallen away in a lot of the social movements that we see in the UK and the US because it has become a bit divisive. There's also questions about, should we, is this denying the kind of differences that we see in different communities? But what's powerful really about it, and not only do I say this, but also other Asian thinkers like John Narayan, is that in terms of thinking of how to move forward in terms of mobilization, political blackness gives us a very solid framework for anti-imperialism and anti-racist solidarity. And this is especially required in terms of the ways in which we think about the racialized networks that are keeping our current global systems in a kind of trap, particularly in terms of moving forward on in environmental justice. And so for this reason, I'm trying to work with the idea of communities of resistance as a coalitional way in which we can think of multi-layered mobilization. And this phrasing, I'm hoping, also retains this idea of kind of pluriversality, right? The idea of multiple cosmologies organizing and speaking together and working together as well. Particularly, I think such forms of organizing provide us with like a robust way forward for how we might consider the practical forms that a missiology that is disobedient. And so my argument, of course, is for a missiology that is disobedient and committed to anti-racist and anti-imperialism might take, especially in terms of reorganizing ourselves epistemically, that is, in terms of how we understand or we know what knowledge is, and practically around the forms of grassroots organizing. In fact, what Sivanandan found was mobilization that occurred in cultural centers. And this is really, really important for how I'm going to talk about churches in a little bit. Sivanandan found cultural platforms such as social centers, dance halls, youth centers, and bookshops could become key nodal points of a political network, and working with them to organize localities. So really we are thinking not in terms only of this larger kind of global scale, but to start at these kind of local centers, to turn these centers into communities of resistance against institutional and popular racism. For example, Sivanandan documents it was not only the use of social centers to teach skills to young persons, but also the setting up of SAW's Free University for Black Studies, as well as weekly and monthly newspapers housed at bookshops. And excitingly, actually, right now in 2020, the scholar Mel's Owuzu raised £60,000 to set up again a free Black university with the key goal of the redistribution of knowledge. And I think that's something that we can really think about in terms of what do our church structures need to do? Another visible example of this kind of action that's happening right now in the UK is the Racial Justice Network in Leeds, which is a network of individuals and communities working across broad platforms in education and the arts in order to address the legacies of colonialism, particularly in terms of the conversations around climate refugees. And a key movement of the RJN at the moment has been on how communities can build resilience through storytelling, arguing that storytelling itself fosters collectivism, right? And what's also really interesting here is that one of the arguments that Sivanandan makes when in looking at the importance of the cultural center is that what makes community resistance powerful is the breaking down of not only ethnic silos, but also class silos. So Sivanandan saw these movements as being across class, across ethnicity, wherein now I think one of the critiques, for example, that I make in my book and others have also made is that there's a certain level of class privilege to the environmental justice movement. But however, if we kind of turn back into these localities, we can perhaps think of a broader, more inclusive movement. This is really important because the concept of a common struggle, that is communities being in resistance together, also refuses the disconnection between the way in which I think politics is ordered, where it forces anti-racist organizing to be separate from environmental justice organizing, that it forces anti-capitalist organizing to be separate from environmental justice organizing, as an example, right? So this idea of looking at for example, together at the nature of capitalism and its international division of labor and the associated forms of global domination, through coalitional ways of working, allows us to build these broad, strong communities of resistance. And being in community together is also very important, I think, because and I have this quote here from Bell Hooks on my slide, is that one of the ways in which we can sustain ourselves is that we are not alone, right? So quite often when I talk to people involved in these different movements, social movements in the United Kingdom or outside of the United Kingdom, there is a lot of anger and there's a lot of fatigue. However, when we are working in these sort of broader coalitional ways, then that sense of loneliness and frustration can be, in a sense, mitigated. And what's also very important here is that communities organize and resisted, not in terms of wanting to stay in their victimhood, right? It's essentially a recognition of the fact that something can be done. There is agency here. We're not, one of the critiques I have had of some of the environmental justice movements we see in the United Kingdom and in the United States and in Canada is there's always this conversation about, oh, look at these poor people in the global south who are flooding or who are baking and drowning. I understand where that comes from, but that's still kind of placing someone in their victimhood. If we start to think of us as being in communities together, in solidarity together, in this way, and we're working together, we are resisting that victimhood narrative. Rather, we are trying to we are recognizing all of us who are being affected by the climate crisis as equal participants in the struggle together. I think this is a really important thing for us to be thinking about, particularly for churches that are trying to perhaps change or re-reflect on the idea of mission, and what is our mission in the public sphere today, particularly in terms of environmental justice. if that doesn't sound like I'm too much on my high horse, which I tend to be, as we all know. And so in the political and social context in which we find ourselves, the public work of radical Christians must be completely focused on the transformation and revolutionizing of society. I think that is an inescapable truth for us right now. That is really what we must be committed to. Of course, I'm a Catholic for my sins, and for me, the document Laudato Si that talks about ecological conversion, that is essentially what it's asking me to do, is to be completely focused on the transformation and revolutionizing of society. If for those of you who haven't read it yet, the Pope has also just put out Laudato Deum, and Laudato Deum has several sections that have a significant critique of power, of the power relationships in the world, and also, and I was just saying this to John before, where the Pope very convincingly argues of a need to kind of push against the current nation state model and to think more in terms of citizens' power and citizens' movements, and how citizens' movements can lead the way for transformation and change, particularly in terms of global governance. And so part of the work that we have here comes from the liberational theologies of the 60s and the 70s, but also cultural theorists like Sivanandan or the Black feminist writer Bell Hooks, who argued that the work we must be engaged in needs to always be constantly antagonistic to the status quo. I think that particular spirit has been a little bit lost in what we have nowadays, and that perhaps can be something we can return to. And in terms of thinking beyond victimhood as well, the mobilization that we're talking about here looks to memorialize and analyze the experiences of those who have suffered from colonial and imperial domination and continue to this day, whether it be economic, social, political, cultural, or institutional. And we not only kind of document and understand these subjective experiences, but to pick up from feminists like Maria Lugones, it's also to ask the question of what are the materials that allow us to understand the situation and also to resist it. So that antagonistic quality comes from constantly asking that question. And there are diverse ways and methods in which perhaps we can come to or try to understand or work through, work through this as well. You're going to ask me, oh my goodness, she's talked a lot of guff and theory and it's getting a bit woolly. I'm sorry about that. I really am a very old academic at heart. So I take the challenge of trying to think more practically. So what does this look like in practice? In the first instance, it will require, I think, and some churches are doing this already, but not all are. I think, as John might say, maybe it's one individual who's doing it and not everyone. But we really need to be rethinking the idea of church. It doesn't matter what denomination you belong to. I think it's very, very important that we start to really be rethinking the idea of church. It will require advocating for greater inclusion in everyday church practices, such as prayer and liturgy, of moves to develop and maintain a more resistive political consciousness. I think that's something that's still very missing in many church spaces that we're part of. And like I said, this requires rethinking the role and idea of the parish or the church community. I think churches as social centers are already excellent spaces from which to engage in public pedagogy, that is the teaching of the community, and also to be community spaces in which we can begin to radically organize. In the same vein as training skills and classes on liberation were operated out of bookstores and youth hostels, why can't we do the same things in local parishes? So just kind of going back to the 60s and the 70s, where the movement was mobilized through these local centers, I think churches are already situated in order to do this, to begin these conversations. Church communities may also consider allying with such efforts as the Racial Justice Network that I've talked about already, or seeking out such networks and collaborating with them on efforts that are both anti-racist and pro-environment. I would also argue for special liturgies that we write that are not only focused on, for example, prayers for the climate or laments for climate refugees, which we have a lot of, but written specifically to teach and mobilize congregations towards being active communities of resistance. So right now, for example, in the Catholic liturgy, we have the intercessionary prayers. Surely these can be written so that people begin to reflect and to think through some of these really uncomfortable conversations in a prayerful way. And perhaps a challenge I can pose to you, if you're still with me at this stage, is to consider a liturgy written for the Lenten season, which may focus in particular on repentance. How could such a liturgy be rewritten if its task was not only repentance, but recognition of the situation of climate refugees, and then ends with a commitment to the work that must be done to transform the status quo? There are, of course, already efforts to write special liturgies for creation and creation care, but these also need to bring in the intersection of racial justice within them. There could also be efforts to use specific calendar events such as Easter and Christmas, and to recenter the biblical readings for these events towards building a radical consciousness. For example, Christian Aid, which is one of the organizations for which I am affiliated to, has a program right now called the Just Scripture, a series which you may be aware of. This is where there's an engagement with a particular biblical text, broken down in different ways, a kind of a close reading. And last Christmas, one of the parishes decided to refocus the nativity story, not in terms of looking at it in terms of the miraculous event of the birth, but by centering the story of the Holy Family's political exile. And it was an uncomfortable sort of situation to be in, but it was a very, very important reflection to go through. What happens when we read those really well-known pieces of the Bible by recentering an element of the story, right? I must underline here that the lead in such efforts cannot be primarily taken by the church community, but must be guided and framed by those who are most affected by the climate crisis, by particularly racial minorities in your parishes, who are taking on sort of anti-racist work, or perhaps by the networks that I talked about, and who are recognized as full participants in these efforts. Such efforts and organizing are already evident, I'm sure, in your community. So it might be a sort of a need for churches and communities to seek out such networks and bring them in to lead and teach on the ways in which churches can shift towards more forms of direct action. So what I'm really advocating for here is the rethinking of church by centering the idea of justice rather than charity. And to echo Sivanandan, we must take on a radical assessment of the cultures of our churches to resituate them in order to be revolutionary. So now that I have lectured and hectored you for a while, I'm going to turn the discussion back to you. And so I have some questions here on the slide, and perhaps you might want to just take the time here allotted to do this quietly by yourself, or perhaps you want to kind of respond here in the chat. We're a nice small group, so it can be quite intimate and a good conversation here. I'm curious to know what's already happening in your church or parish community on these areas. What local groups might you need to be linking up to? And what else might we need to do to rethink church and mission? And maybe a third one, and this is the conversation that I'm having with my students right now, what is hindering us from rethinking church in this way? So I'm going to reduce my screen a little bit here, but I'll keep it up here, and hopefully we can start to have a small conversation. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Anu. That was amazing. So much to think and process through. Does anybody, rather than me just kind of chipping in, does anyone want to respond to that first question?
Apart from being part of Hazelnut, I'm also part of pretty radical, relatively radical Catholic parish, and that's my Sunday morning. It's in the heart, in the centre of Bristol, in the about the poorest area of the city. And we've had the season of creation every Sunday. For the season of creation, we've had very much intercessionary prayers, including the environmental issues, and it's a majority Black African congregation. I mean, or the largest group, but there's about 60 different nationalities altogether. But I find it really difficult to imagine anything becoming very, even in that context, with a very, very clear justice-led leadership. We're about to go into becoming a lay-led parish. It still feels a mile away, at least in the UK, that a parish will actually become a sort of radical movement. And I don't know whether, from what you've done, how important is place to this? How important is it that people actually live together? Because we are relatively dispersed, both Hazelnut as a community, but also where I also go to church, the Catholic church I go to. They are very dispersed communities. We've just done a map exercise to show where people live across the city. I'm not sure how some of this can actually really happen unless people are, once a week is not enough for me to build a community of resistance or communities, radical communities. It feels like there's got to be something significantly more. And obviously the old Anglican parishes were in theory small enough, but I mean, those are now extremely marginal themselves. 1% of the population in an area might be Anglican if you're lucky. And that's the gap I see now, is that with the church being any, even if it was to join with others, it's just the nature of the church. It's not tight enough as a community to actually go forward. And sadly, we also have the kind of thing around XR, Christian XR and all those kind of things, where the real radical people join that, and therefore they're not really kind of necessarily feeding into the local parishes, because they've had to make their move and join somewhere else because things are just not moving fast enough for them, or they're the kind of person that actually does want to literally lay their life or their body on the line for things, and that's not where, sadly, a huge number of Christians are. So that's just, that would be my reflections so far.
Hello. Yes, I'm live in an area where I'm a trustee at the Wellspring Settlement and church warden at St Luke's, and I've worked in the area for many years, and we are just, after many years, all working together with the mosque and the Somali Resource Centre, which is based there, and it feels like there's something starting there. Probably the church is very resistant actually to this, but we are going to be having a major new project for the church and refurb, and we have to think about going ahead and making the church not once a week but more to be something that's sustainable in the future, that's run much more and is part of all that other community going on in the area. So I have a little bit of hope now that that things can move on, and it's been very interesting listening to you and tonight, Anna, and how you see it. Thank you.
I certainly think at Hazelnut, it's really interesting. I think trying to put at least the climate emergency at the center. One of the things I think, maybe if I went first to like one of the issues I see is when I had kind of, as you mentioned, that kind of climate conversion, it was a realization that huge amounts of change are coming, whether we like it or not, and there's nothing that's going to stop the massive change that's coming. And it changed everything in the way I saw it, and thought, well, what is radical is actually preparation, and actually it's not as radical as it appears. But if you're a part of a system and you're trying to save that system, or go back to a way of it being like at the center of society, which I think a lot of the church is, then there's just such a radical disagreement in terms of how to go forward, because being radical is not an option. If you're seeing it as saving something, you have to become more and more conservative and less risky. And I see that is just prevalent in, especially being part of a state church like the Church of England. It's about how do you save this? And so riskiness is just not a part of the conversation. And so in a sense, you all instantaneously in any meeting you have people who have very radically different worldviews, and none of those worldviews are stated or even conversed about. So all of a sudden, what happens is you have something like a same-sex conversation that as actually at its root not about the Bible or about sexuality, but it's about whether you feel like change is coming or not, or how you view change, and whether things should change or not change. And that's, it's kind of prevalent in everything. So I think that's been it's been one of my reflections. It's been made it challenging. I think what we're trying to do, at least at Hazelnut, is to try and just be really good at trying new things, testing things out. But I think what we don't want to do is I think we want to gift everything back to the church and encourage others to come with us. And I think that's where I really like this idea of coalitions and collaborations, where it's not and at least at Hazelnut, we really want to work with others and see us all as working together. And I think that actually brings a lot more joy into ministry, when it's like we're all going in the same direction rather than I need to build my kingdom. Yeah, that's something I thought about.
Thanks, everyone. Wondering if anyone else on the call wants to come in or maybe comment on any of the other kind of questions that we have in the chat. I mean, I also realize that for different denominations. Yeah, Jess, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say, oh, hang on. Oh. Hi, sorry. We are eating. Just wanted to say a massive thanks, because found it really, really helpful and thought-provoking and inspiring. I think I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or advice about, like, I really loved what you said about not seeing people who are in other countries as kind of vulnerable people that we need to protect. And I guess just like practically how do we start having those conversations with the wider church, but also kind of how do we foster that collaboration? And yeah, sorry if you've kind of already covered all that, but yeah, I just wondered, like, really practically, like what can we do? I'm going to turn my camera off, not because just because you don't want to see me eat pizza, basically. But yeah, thank you.
No, that looks delicious. Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's a question that I think we're all kind of trying to struggle through, a lot of us as well. One of the things that seems to be working really well, and this is why I'm talking about coalitions a lot, is that when for example with sort of the groups I'm working at here, when we bring in a group like the Racial Justice Network, where you have, for example, there's like a visible example of someone who has come to the United Kingdom as a climate refugee, but they also were a lawyer, where they were in Somalia or Malawi, and they come in and they kind of do a talk and they kind of show what they're working on. Automatically, that kind of visible example of someone provokes and changes that kind of reception of this person, because they're not seen as a sort of an object of pity or as a victim, but essentially they come in and they kind of are able to claim their agency. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm very eager, not in that sense, from my own experience of seeing how well it's working in other church spaces and other parish settings, to have that kind of way in which we are a little bit wider than our parish community, right? So we bring in from the outside through networks like I said, the Racial Justice Network or the Migrants Organize, or in the case where I'm in Kakodi, where we have an interreligious dialogue going on, and we're kind of cross-posting between immigrant churches and very sort of more white middle-class churches, and we're opening up these spaces of collaborative dialogue. That really also allows for these conversations to happen. But a lot of it also goes down to, for example, my colleague Ryan Turnbull, who's in Winnipeg, kind of doing a little bit of an audit of the liturgies and the prayers that we have. So that's one of my examples in terms of intercessionary prayers. When you go through some of the prayers and when you go through some of the sort of messaging that we have in churches, and we realize that actually it's kind of reinforcing that victimhood narrative, that's a good place to go step back and say, you know what, let's write the prayer differently. Let's change the messaging that we have in our churches. It's also a good challenge to go back to, so for example, Christian Aid, if you're with the Anglican Church in the UK, or CAFOD, if you're in the Catholic Church in the UK, to go and say, like, what's the narrative happening here? And so that was a really good lesson for Christian Aid, where they started to, where they had that exercise of not, using the miraculous birth story, but to center Jesus as that political exile. But then Christ was a political exile, but was also the savior of the earth. So there's this complexity within the Christian story itself, of the most vulnerable person who was also this very powerful person. So I think it's doing these little small things like that, and being able to, it's difficult, of course, but being able to do these small exercises, as well as I think reaching out into these broader coalitions. I guess that those are the sort of examples that I would kind of push forward with as well. Yeah, sorry, John, did you want to come in? You looked like you wanted to come in.
I love what you're saying. I was just gonna say one thing that we found really by accident at Hazelnut is how much land is a unifier, because land is non-judgmental. It basically is welcoming to anyone in any tradition at anywhere, and in a sense we found it as like a common grace. So and because it's also unifier, because planting is essentially the same across the world. There's different emphasis, and I get different temperatures, but it's essentially seed, water, earth, temperature. And so at least with the number of folks that have come from Hong Kong, I feel like there's been a really beautiful connecting point and growing together, in terms of like hopefully being a radical home. Rather than having to create. So nature itself is the liturgy.
Thanks, John. That's such a beautiful thing as well. And I think we also have in scripture is very focused on this idea of solidarity. St. Paul talks about us all being part of one body. So if something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us, right? So we share that sort of agency. We also share that oppression together. So how can we kind of refocus it, I think, a little bit in our conversations? And a lot of that also has to do, I think, with those of us who are doing this work, making a commitment to doing that kind of public education within our churches. And whatever spaces that we have, we can use them to kind of, reteach the narratives a little bit. And David, I absolutely take your point. It's difficult if you're doing it just once a week, but I think this is where it comes in, that we start to think about what are the spaces we already have, like, youth groups or Catholic women's groups, or, when we're meeting as a gardening group, or when we're meeting as a whatever different societies, where we start to kind of have these conversations in multiple spaces, right? So it's not only on the Sunday or the Saturday, but it's happening throughout the week. And another way in which to, I think, once again, to ensure these conversations are happening in multiple levels is to be threading through. So right now, for example, a lot of the faith groups that I work with are also very involved in the community food banks. And you're say you're volunteering with that food bank once or twice a week, and that's also an instance where you're starting to have those conversations as well. right? And so that in those interlinkages, I think, between community organization groups is also where you start to have those conversations in a more multiple focus, where you're also thinking in that sense of that lived experience as well. Because another kind of critique I might have of the environmental justice movements here, this is terrible that I'm constantly critiquing them, is also there's a significant lack of a class analysis. I think there's a huge problem. However, when you start to be thinking through, you know, the particularities of what it means to be living in at a certain income level, or with a lack of access to justice, or you know, inability to get your benefits, for example, right now in the United Kingdom, if you don't get an appointment with Citizens Advice, you might be sleeping on the streets for a month before you get your benefits. And this is a significant issue here, right? I think these things are also linked to the fact that, you know, we have a significant climate crisis. In Scotland, we've had torrential rain for a week. And I actually don't know what is being done for anyone who's sleeping rough outside. And the reason why they're sleeping rough is because of how difficult it is to access your benefits in this country now. Right. However, having that engagement with the community food banks or other community spaces is a way in which to have those conversations in multiple ways. These are not always easy for churches to do, but I think it's important to have that happen. And perhaps so I'm a layperson in a Catholic church, so a lot of what I do is try to keep as much pressure as I can on, you know, the priests or anyone who's sort of in power around me to make that happen, or to organize these things. So we need to find those pressure points where we can then build these things. Other forms of working through are the creative and the arts, I think. So when you look back at the mobilizations of the 60s and the 70s, we can see a lot of arts-based work, little newsletters, and particularly organizing young people around these things. In Nigeria, where Christian Aid works, there's a really fantastic example of young people using kind of collating issues on their smartphones, right? So doing a kind of a citizens journalism project, where then they are broadcasting that and sending it around as like little WhatsApp notes to people in the community on larger WhatsApp groups. And it's a fantastic piece of public education that they've just done informally to talk about issues regarding sectarian violence, right? And they're also identifying where the police are not stepping up and not supporting communities, so they're able to mobilize together and become a kind of a community peacekeeping force. You know, so it's really interesting to see what can be done with very, very little. Yeah. So I would also encourage creativity, like how can we be creative in these ways as well? Sorry, I'll stop talking now.
I'm a bit conscious of this being recorded, so but I don't know. I think I can say it without actually mentioning specifics necessarily. But I remember we've moved twice, our home twice as Hazelnut. And I remember one Sunday, a group of people coming back with some masks who were part of our community, who'd been on a demonstration. And it is about one particular situation in the world, and it's about one particular group of people who are a significant part of our community. And I was very struck by, I mean, I have separately, individually gone to a solidarity demonstration for that community in Bristol as well. But I'm just wondering, I don't know, John, whether we've ever done it. Have we ever actually gone as a group to support those protests? I don't know if they're still going on, but for a while they were happening very regularly. It isn't about the climate, but it was about a very much sort of part of our community. And I don't know. I mean, I just had that real sense that, you know, these people were coming back with their masks to almost show us where they'd been. I mean, that was that, you know. And I mean, sorry, I'm trying to be as vague as possible, but you know, it felt to me like that would have been an act of solidarity, because it's about the issues that are directly affecting those people and their ongoing struggle. You know, so. And I don't know if that is the way. I mean, I've worked in community organising with Citizens UK and done a lot with them, and you have to sometimes go with the issues that are the core issue. In order for your issue to be taken seriously, you have to take seriously the issues of others. And I think, you know, have we missed a trick there? I don't know where that opportunity is now gone, but it just feels like that is. I don't know if that's an illustration of what you were trying to, you know, what you were talking about earlier in your representation.
Thanks, David. I think it's a tricky one. I think, and I was talking to Annie about this before her talk, is feeling really divided. So I mean, I think I do feel probably my own situation maybe has affected it some, in that because I'm a dual citizen and my kids are dual citizens, and they've passed laws, the current government, to say that they could easily deport you if you're caught in those types of situations, has, I feel like, muted my voice in some ways. But we have collectively done, like, climate marches and stuff. But I think we could do more. I think part of the thing for me is a radical church one that just speaks up to power, or is it one that organizes collectively to live differently? And I think probably both. And I think I think maybe our focus has been more on the how do we organize to live differently in the face of this world and prepare. But I think there's definitely space to do more. And I think Citizens is launching. I just went to their meetings in Bristol, and they're trying to get going. I think my only critique on Citizens would be that it seems to be another group that you have to fully join rather than bring what you want. And that was such a shame, because I came really wanting to just bring what I had at Hazelnut, and it seemed like you're invited to be a Citizens person rather than be you at that. And I found that hard. I just don't have the capacity. I think that was a struggle for me.
It first came to Britain from the States to Bristol. Bristol was the first place it happened in the 90s, and I was slightly involved then. But it is sad, because that's the trouble, is that some of our churches didn't have the capacity to be full members. And yet, if you aren't fully in, that you're either in or you're out. That's the sad thing about it. But obviously, that's the way they get, mass mobilization, is that's how it partly works. But it is hard, because not everyone can commit to the level, and a lot of Anglican churches in particular left because they couldn't make the level of commitment. And that's, I mean, I think that goes back to what, where we started really, is this level of commitment to get this kind of level of change is hard. It's really hard in a church context, and that's where the coalition thing that you've been speaking about, I think, is so helpful, really, because you don't have. I mean, I think Citizens, to be fair, it is, there are some lighter, commitments from certain bodies. I helped set up in Somerset, and they were very small bodies, really. Some of the churches, but they were still, they were still active members. But it does allow.
And I just want to say, I love the work of Citizens, so I'm not critiquing Citizens. One of the things I'm thinking was, am I able to host them, and are we able to, how do I cheer them on and do what we do?
That's the problem. It's hard to be supportive unless you're fully in, and that's their model. That's what they want. They've stuck to that through in, and we tried to allow some. There was a youth group who wanted to join us, who couldn't afford the dues, and for a time one of the public schools paid for the dues, but that wasn't a sustainable thing, because those people were never actually going to be fully members, because someone else was always paying their dues, which is expected. Sorry, anyway, maybe getting off the point, but it's I'm pretty pleased it is starting. I'd heard rumors, so I'm glad you've at least encountered them somewhere, John. Anyway, that's good.
Yeah, I think what they're doing is fantastic. Can I ask Annie one final
John, I think you're frozen.
question off piece? Just let me know. Oh, if I can you hear me? It feels like I might have Oh, there you are. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Just say it again, John. Can you repeat what you said, because we did lose you.
Annie, you talked a lot about us being a radical church. Why do you think so much of the church is not radical but radicalized? And instead of being a church that tries to change society, we fall for false prophets so quickly. I think of kind of the movement in America for Trump, and to be a church that is, literally proud of being a nationalistic church at the exclusion of those. And so it's just the opposite of what you're saying. And why do you think churches fall for that and do that?
John, you always ask me questions that make me feel that I wish I was sort of like the UN Secretary General or something.
Sorry.
I think in many ways the answer is kind of a simple one, because I think that those particular churches, those sort of radicalized spaces that you're talking about, are unwilling to relinquish power, the power that they hold. Right? They enjoy what they have. They don't really want to be affected by complexity. I think over the weekend, we have seen something very specific in how people were so happy to kind of have back the clarity of a goodie versus a baddie, if you know what I mean, right? People like that kind of clarity. If engaging in the kind of work that we're talking about here requires looking at the gray areas, it requires examining global power structures, it requires a recognition of, especially if you live in and work or have benefited from, a sort of Western way of living, it requires saying, my comfort and my wealth and my ability to move in the world is because of the power that I hold or the power that has been afforded to me, right? And I think that's a significant issue, and that's something to confront. But I think it's also important, and it sort of saddens me sometimes when I look at some of these sort of what you call radicalized movements, is that they also kind of don't realize how they're being sort of sold a particular message because of, I think, larger sort of multinational, shall we say, corporate interests or nation state interests that don't really also want to lose the power that they hold. I think in the past 8 years or so, we've seen the increase in global anti-rights campaigning that is extremely homophobic, that is extremely misogynistic, that is imbued with climate denialism and skepticism. And there's a lot of money that gets poured into it. I was at the feminist kind of gathering in Kigali, and one of the biggest worries that we have at the moment is how the kind of human rights movements are being quite depleted because a lot of money is being fueled into the global anti-rights campaigns. And what's also, I think, not saddening, but actually makes me a bit angry, is that when you kind of analyze the rhetoric of some of these movements, is that they have very successfully appropriated the language of human rights and freedoms to make their campaigns, to make their kind of conversations about, well, it's my right to not believe in this, so it's my right to have this, to have private property and so on, to make it a moral good. They have taken all the language of the, if you look at the movements of the 60s and 70s that I talk about and I'm very fond of, a lot of that language has been reappropriated, kind of repackaged in order to make moral a lot of the climate denialism rhetoric, right? It's a strange kind of subversion and abstraction of progressive movements. And I think that's something that we also need to be kind of calling out and asking questions about. And it's difficult to do that, right? I mean, it's quite easy to get suckered in. Sometimes I listen to someone, I'm like, well, that's this. I mean, I talk about coalitions and you're talking about a coalition, but you're not talking about coalition in the same way I'm talking about coalition, right? And the purpose of that kind of appropriation is to undermine social movements. And that's really why we need to be building these collaborative, multi-layered ways of working. David, you're talking about, how you need to. I do struggle sometimes with a campaign that says you have to be all in here, because not everyone can be all in. Actually, we need to be sharing the burdens. Each of us can be contributing what we can or taking the lead where we can, right? I think if you're going to be also totalitarian in your social movements, you're not going to get very far. We need to be working cooperatively. And to work cooperatively and to be breaking down silos helps us to resist some of the strategies of some of those, as you say, John, radicalized movements that we're seeing. And we have to understand that the reason why those radicalized movements behave in the way they do is that their ultimate purpose is to solidify and extend the power and control that they already enjoy. Actually, just going back to Lada today, I'm sorry about this, everyone. I had to read it this morning for a forum, so it's in my head. And Francis has this really fantastic line where he talks about, talks about the misinformation that essentially is being used to disguise the ethical decadence of power. So false information that disguises the ethical decadence of power. And I was like, that is such a fantastic way of analyzing that situation. And so within that, I think we need to be calling those out, but we also need to be picking up, just to kind of pull here from sort of my Buddhist background as well, to be working in terms of a kind of a epistemic compassion, essentially kind of trying to actively listen, but also pushing forward in terms of conversation and collaboration, and talking about the need to dismantle not only our individual egos, because sometimes, of course, in social movements, we all want to say, my thing is the best one, but actually it isn't, right? Like, how can we share across and how can we work across together? We need to dismantle the egotism of our own particular individual, one little church or one little, movement, and share across. But also, kind of, I think this is why the shift from the I to the we is important, because the reason why the radicalized movements are powerful is because it recenters the I. It makes you feel powerful. It makes your place in the world feel good and okay and safe and the best thing. Whereas the movements that we are trying to build, those of us who are in this room, is thinking in a much more multiple way. We're actually trying to, hopefully if we do it right, we're trying to do that important work of letting go, right? And so the attraction of one is that there's accumulation and power there. And the difficulty of us organizing here is that at the heart of it, the ethical question and the ethical goal is to be completely relinquishing power and transforming it. And that's also why I think the movements, perhaps of those of us in the room, kind of fall apart, because that's a difficult thing to do. I hope that wasn't too heavy for so late in the evening.
It was wonderful, and I swear I could. We could just keep going. We reached our time, but it's just so wonderful. We'll have to continue this conversation because I feel like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much to talk about. I do, as radical as we want to be, I have to give announcements, the most non-radical thing. So very sorry about that whiplash there. But we've been doing this Harvest Lecture Series, and we're calling it Beauty and Justice. And I just want to say last week's talk was up from Kat, and Kat is from the she's part of the St. Kateri Conservation Center, which is a Catholic conservation group in America, but really all over the world. And I recommend watching that because part of what they're doing is really talking about ways to live out what Anu's talking about as well, and they link really well. Part of what I'm thinking about is how they're connecting kind of indigenous, kind of Native American folks who have been displaced from their land and not able to grow sacred corn, and how they're kind of reconnecting folks to the land to be able to grow that corn and give it back to them. And that's the type of kind of work that just is really beautiful, living it out in the land as well. So I recommend that. And you've been wonderful, and we're going to put you up on the YouTube channel tomorrow. Also, just look out next week. I know YouTube, you've made it. This is going to be amazing. And then next week, we're back. We're here again. Please share it out. Invite people. We've got Alistair McIntosh for Prayer as the Cosmic Root of Poetry. And I think, again, this is just going to really flow together because Alistair's somebody who's been really trying to, I think, live this out and imbibe what we've been talking about for a very long time. So that's next week. And then we take a bit of a break. And on the 7th of November, we're back. And it's Regina Ebner, who is part of Arasha UK, and me. And we're talking about unlocking the power of church land. So we're talking about, and I think it will continue on this vein of like kind of how do we use the land in order to be a radical community in an age of climate breakdown. I'm going to stop the recording now.